Good afternoon, and welcome to our latest installment of Engagement Experts 101. This is our live podcast where we cover a variety of emerging HR and people trends. My name is Stephen Huerta, and as usual, I'll be your host today. As you may have noticed, we took a short break during the summer as we neared vacation time and PTO time. So this is our first episode back. It feels great to be back, but wow, a lot has changed in the world since our last episode. Since the Fed started making interest rate increases over the summer, the markets and companies alike have been trying to understand, are we in a recession or not? While metrics point to economic activity decreasing quarter over quarter, which suggests a recession, the labor market continues to be red hot, with unemployment continuing to sit at historically low levels. Over the last month, though, companies have been increasingly laying off recruiters, terminating employees, and implementing hiring freezes, all of which point to difficult times looming ahead. Further confusing matters, companies are still dealing with the lingering effects of the Great Resignation. That means while companies are laying workers off, they're also having to fill positions as employees continue to leave their jobs at record rates. So what is the right course of action, and what should people leaders be doing right now? Well, that's a great question, and what we will be focusing on today. How to take the right action to recession-proof your business and also set yourself up to thrive regardless of where the next 6 months take us. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind you all of a few housekeeping items. We'll kick off this session with a quick poll that will allow you to give us some input. We'll talk about early in the conversation. From there, we'll have a short 20 to 30-minute conversation with our amazing guests, whom I'll introduce shortly. Then we'll tee up our Ask Me Anything section, which will allow you to ask questions directly to the speaker. Then from there, we will obviously, as always, this discussion is for you. So please drop any questions into Zoom at any point in time. With that said, I believe the quick poll has already been launched, which kind of took my focus away there. So my colleague Oksana has launched the quick poll. So please share your feedback. We'll come back to this later in the discussion. And so over the last 6 months, I've had the privilege to get to know our guests really, really well. And each time we speak, it feels like we could be on the phone for hours. He brings a wealth of experience and knowledge in the people space, which I'm thrilled to share with you guys today. So excited to have you. Welcome, Jackson Lynch. How are you doing today?
Stephen, I'm doing great. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And it's kind that you say that you can be on the phone with me for hours. Most people think, or at least say, that I just talk too much. The way you phrased that was way nicer. Thank you for that.
Well, I like to start these discussions off with getting to know our guests a little bit better. So as I call it my Brene Brown question, what is your story? How did you get to where you are today? And specifically, share with us your experience that you've had in the people space.
Sure. I've always been a little bit of a different HR person. I grew up in operations, grew up in my dad's family business. So I learned how to sweep the floor and build furniture and sofas from scratch. I have some experience in engineering with the Boeing company, and then have most of my education has been based around finance. So I'm not your typical HR person. In fact, I've made all the kind of frontline manager mistakes back in the engineering days. With that background, though, I have gravitated towards solving talent challenges the same way someone like in supply chain might try to solve issues. And in fact, I think that by talking about it in terms like that, makes it much easier for us to make a meaningful impact on the talent world. I've had an opportunity to work for some great companies, like Frito-Lay, Nestle, among others. And I've been able to lead some pretty large organizations through significant changes, transformations that ultimately led to both serving as CHRO for some of these companies and starting my own human capital consultancy. Because as we have smaller organizations that don't have the ability to have academy-trained HR folks, I have found it to be my calling to both help those organizations and the HR people in them to be able to successfully navigate these roads that they may not have been ready for otherwise. So I do a lot of work with CHROs, with boards, with CEOs during times of transitions, and I really think we're entering one of those moments right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my experience, there are like two clear tracks within HR. There are kind of the functional technical HR people that kind of grew up and rose the ranks within the HR function. And there are those that have come into HR through kind of the business angle. And I am from the first bucket. So I kind of grew up in HR. And I've always admired the leaders and mentors that I've had that have come in from the business side, because you just bring such a unique perspective and have experiences that are so different to those of us that just, have had the career solely in HR. And so that's one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on the show for this particular episode. And so you've been in the people game for more than 25 years. What do you think has changed the most over this period of time?
Well, over the last few years, you've certainly seen the amount of talent change accelerate. And the impact of the pandemic and the government business reactions to it certainly have accelerated that as well. But I think the single biggest challenge, I won't say challenge, single biggest adjustment over the last 25 years has been the individual and their ability to effectively manage their own career with their own choices, with access to technologies that allow them to see what opportunities are, understand what their market might be. And as a result of that, I think the biggest challenge and change in the business world has been that a recognition that at its core, whether it's a strategy or an execution challenge, it's all about talent. And so I think the role of talent in successful businesses, especially in the tech world, but certainly beyond that, is probably the biggest change I've seen in the last 25 years. We are now the means of production that go home every night versus supporting the means of production in more traditional manufacturing environments.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's, I describe it as a power struggle, right? The power struggle between the employer, who has control, the employer or the employee. And, I like the way you put it, because it feels as though the employee has never had more power to dictate their career, the next step, where they want to work, what jobs they'll take and won't take, in a real macro sense than today's kind of market in today's day and age. And so what you shared really resonates with me. And I think there's a whole nother topic that we could get into there, but I don't want to take too much time from the main topic that we're going to be covering today. So, I think this is going to be an amazing conversation. I'm so glad you joined us. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the details, but let's take a quick look at the quick poll results. So Oksana, if you could stop the quick poll. So so we don't have a ton of respondents here, but those that did share, most or all of those that shared were in the workforce during the last recession. So you guys definitely can appreciate, what the recession, the down markets are like. It looks like we're split on whether or not, no, everyone's in agreement. Some strongly agree, others just agree, but it looks like most are also aligned in that, there's likely going to be a down market in the next year. And then on the Great Resignation question, yeah, there's still some lingering impacts there. Which is what I'm hearing when I talk to CHROs and chief people officers out there, that is a challenge. And the last question is, our company is communicating a clear message to employees regarding the future. This one is a little more split. And so, what are your takeaways here? Any interesting, any surprising results here?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think HR folks tend to be the tip of the spear on these things, and at least the good ones are. And I can see what's coming, and that's what the limited poll responses might suggest. It's an interesting environment. I listened to a podcast called the All In Podcast, which is a bunch of folks from Silicon Valley that have kind of a wide range of interests, but they're angel investors, early stage investors. And one of the folks on there talked about a conference that he went to with many of the founders that were there. And at this conference, all the founders recognized where we were heading into and thought that they were going to be the exception. Everyone else is going to have to prepare themselves for the recession, but we're going to be the ones that don't have to worry about it. And the consensus on that podcast, at least, was that's a faulty way of walking into this thing, because the burn rates are going to become increasingly important. So I agree. That's where we're headed.
Yeah, I think that it is also surprising to me in the conversations that I'm having that a lot of companies still appear to be watching from the sidelines. So they're like some I guess early adopters of change, those that I guess they may have read the PowerPoints that the venture capital firms, have put out there predicting recession and what to do during those times. And there are others that, are hoping that it might not impact their businesses. And so, I'm curious to get your thoughts on, which camp, you should be in, which camp you would advise the HR leaders to be in. But I have essentially just based on your responses already that I know what that answer is going to be. So, well, I think, I'm ready to get into the conversation if you are. So are you ready to jump into this?
Let's go.
All right. Okay, let's do it. All right. So, I like to dive in head first in these conversations. I hope that's okay. Based on your experience, let's talk about it up front. Do you feel that we're in a recession right now?
Yeah. There's no doubt that we're in a recession. Ignore all the noise from our political leaders because they're managing a different agenda than the question that you asked. We're facing significant headwinds, and normally you want to see a gap. The Federal Reserve is chartered with trying to keep inflation about 2%, which allows the appropriate flex of monetary policy, but also allows predictability in pricing, which is helpful for businesses to go forward. And as such, you tend to see a mix between inflation and what the funds rate is of about 2%. Today, it's over 7%. That's from the print from a couple of weeks back. I think later on at the top of the hour, I think we'll see them make another move that gets closer there. But even with the 0.75, we're still a long way away from getting within a couple of percentage points of taming inflation. So I think we were going to have significant work as we go forward. The Fed's going to have to take action. They're going to have to, and they're going to have to for a time period to go. And you and I talked about this before. Unemployment might seem low, but it's a bit of a misnomer because unemployment is low, but the participation rate in the labor market is also at an all-time. It's at least 5 or 6%. It's in the low 60s, where historically it's been in the upper 60s. And so if you add current unemployment rate and the underrepresentation in the market, it would suggest that we already have a very, very challenging labor market. It feels tight, depending on where you are, because you have a mismatch between the jobs that people need and the capabilities of the people that are looking for work. And that has been roughly 10 million jobs over the last almost 3 years now, where our educational systems and our current people processes within corporations is not making that connective point. And so, you end up thinking about, are we in a recession? Yes. And we have inflation. That's a dangerous combination, and candidly, one that we haven't seen since the 70s, where you may not have even been born yet, Stephen.
I was around, and I definitely remember the carryover into the 80s. I often tell my kids, like, going to Walmart to buy shopping, to get our clothes, and only getting one nice pair of shoes or one nice shirt, because times were tough. And you're right. When we haven't lived in this type of world where, inflation is making a real impact on our pocketbooks. So right. I think that's a real issue.
Yeah. And look, people aren't acting rationally. And that is not a harbinger of good things to come. It feels.
So tell me more about what you mean by people aren't acting rationally.
Well, if you go back to the early 2000s, everyone was acting like the .com companies were going to be sustainable, that you could have companies that don't make money. As long as you were driving growth, everything else would take care of itself. And certainly for some companies, that worked. But even the Amazons of the world eventually had to start making and printing money. There was zero chance that most of those companies were going to be able to survive. But at the height of it, you had people buying into these companies, and up until the crash, they even as it was crashing, you still had people that were talking about these are wonderful buying opportunities, and you had people leaving corporate jobs and joining companies that didn't have a shelf life of 6 months. You saw something similar in 2008 that was primarily driven by the housing crisis, but was primarily a liquidity challenge. As we were going through that, you had folks that were continuing to drive housing prices up to an all-time high. Primarily driven by a demand side element. And boy, I think we've had 6 or 7 straight months of the number of homes being sold going down. But we are still very much at the top of the market on a real estate standpoint. So we're printing a lot of money. We are still buying assets at an alarmingly high rate. We now have a broadly unregulated market in the cryptocurrencies and distributed financial technologies that folks are leaning into in a speculative nature. I can't remember if I said it, we have home prices at an all-time high. Everything is great, and people are continuing to spend as if everything was going to continue to be rosy, which is why even with all of the headwinds that you see, the amount of consumer debt has skyrocketed up over the last 3 months. And that's what I mean. We're not acting irrationally, or we're not acting rationally. And it's a continuation of a pattern that we've seen over the last 20 years.
And I agree with all of that. And so, we talked a little bit about how much the world has changed, just in the last couple of years. If you take that all the way back to the last recession, 2007 to 2009, for those of us that are still in the game, what should HR leaders be doing differently this time around? Or I guess phrased differently, what is different and unique about this potential situation that may be different to some of the recessions that we've had in the past?
Yeah, so from an HR perspective, I think we have 2 charters. One, we need to be ruthless, and we need to be compassionate. Yeah. Compassionate about how we think about handling the challenges that are facing us, but ruthless in stepping up to the plate and actually making those decisions. Even if they're challenging to step through. So I had an example at a client that was their eyes were bigger than their stomach, as the saying goes. A very successful organization, publicly traded, has great ambitions of growth. They're a consolidator in a fragmented market, and they had built an organizational structure that was really going to enable them to go capture on some market opportunities. The challenge is the revenue didn't support those, and as such, their burn rate was such that they ultimately had to make some really tough choices. And they had a part of the business where revenue was consistent and can be counted on, and the sales process was efficient. And then they had 4 or 5 more speculative areas, and they had more headcount allocated towards those because they were betting on the future. But this was an organization that ultimately had to make really tough choices of where they wanted to invest. And maybe they can't invest in all 5, maybe they can only invest in 2. And as an HR person, part of our job is to with math and with data, help drive those questions. Because if we don't, we'll find ourselves in a position where we will be reactive. Whatever cuts and restructuring we need to make will be more, to the bone. Historically, companies haven't been very thoughtful about how they've approached it. So I think we have a unique opportunity as we sit here.
And when you say compassionate, I agree, I agree with both points. I agree with, needing to be ruthless. I subscribe to the school of thought that is, cut once and cut deep if you can.
100%.
But not, that's not a popular way. That there can be resistance, and leaders can drag their feet, obviously, right?
Yeah.
In taking that approach. It's difficult, and it's uncomfortable. There's a lot involved, right? It's a horrible thing that if you can avoid altogether, that is the ideal, that's the ideal state, in my opinion. But there are some macro levers that are out of our control. And so I totally see the ruthless point. Let's talk a little bit about the compassionate point. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think part of being compassionate is having one big one versus a series of smaller cost-cutting measures, because that allows people to get to the other side of the change. There's a long time change management quip that says the change isn't over until people stop talking about it. Well, if you're always worried about the next one, because to cut out 10% of your workforce, you're going to take 5 cuts of 2% each. At some point, you're going to start worrying about the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and to say nothing about the financial impact of deferring some of those cuts until later you're still burning cash. So I think part of compassion is being thoughtful, diving deep and doing it once. I think another part of compassion is actually be thoughtful about what you're not going to be doing and what you need to re-engineer or repurpose or reinvest. There are places where you can pull headcount out to reallocate it in other places. The only kind of wrong answer is just pull headcount out and don't change any of the work, because that is not a compassionate thing to do to the folks that survive the upfront decision. Then I think the third part of compassion is recognizing that 95% of the workforce is there and is dedicated to your organization, is trying to do a good job. Help them on the way out, whether that is by being a bit more generous on severance terms, whether it's being a bit more generous on supporting them with outplacement services and the like, and then being very transparent with the remaining organization of what happened, why it happened, and what this means as we go forward.
Love it. I love that. I love all 3 of those points. And so for those that are going through, the HR leaders that, were not in the workforce for the last recession, they're going to be going through this for the first time. How do you think those people leaders, that are going to be responding, for the first time, going through this process for the first time, what should they be doing, and how, what's your advice for those individuals? Do you have a playbook of sorts, anything you can share? Like what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a playbook, but the first thing I would share is this is a unique opportunity for an HR person to be a business leader. And many HR folks have been reactive when it comes to organizational design. They have been more administrative than strategic. And yet most HR folks want to play in a strategic role. This is one of those times. And it means you've got to lean in and advocate for positions that are sometimes not offered by the HR leader, right? We tend to think about how to be defensible in our decision making, but we need to be effective, efficient, and defensible in that order. All three are important. But if you are focused on the effectiveness of workforce design first, you can solve for defensibility easily. But this is where you play the strategic role. So that's number one. In terms of a playbook, I guess I would throw a handful of thoughts. One, I think you need to make sure that you have your top talent in the jobs that will allow them to the maximum benefit for the organization, which means actually thinking about and using whatever people development assessments that you have, whether it be a 9-box or something else, rather than, you may have a great talent, if they're in the wrong role, you're sub-optimizing the output of the business. And so step one is I would be very thoughtful about how do I put my top talent where they can have the maximum benefit. I think number two, starting today, you have the ability to accelerate performance management with people who you know should be a customer, not an employee. And the more you do that today, there's nothing but upside. Your business performance will improve. You will have better defensibility as you end up making decisions downstream. And to the degree that you can drive out underperformers, it gives you more ability to advocate for compassionate severance terms for the folks that are good performers, but the business is going to have to go in a different direction. I think the third thing I would do is I would take extra steps today to lock in my top talent, both financially and connectively. So financially is pretty straightforward, but as we are going into a recession, I think we will find that things like bonus programs, things like anything that's tied to stock or other valuation methods is going to be challenged to deliver what they would have delivered under normal circumstances. And so I think as an HR leader, you ought to be thinking ahead of time about how do you lock these folks in? Because for you to get through to the other side successfully, you need to have the right people in the right spots. Connectivity-wise, comes back to the old Gallup, first break all the rules. People leave their bosses. And so how are we making sure that we have the right mentorship, especially with historically underrepresented groups, because it's important for us to lock those people in and make them feel a part of and a belonging to the organization that we're going to escape the other side of this thing with. And I guess the last one is I think you have to really challenge the underlying business assumptions. And I made reference to that with my with one of my clients who was going to invest in a lot of different things. I think an HR leader has the ability to say, we have a unique opportunity to pull costs out of the business by being more thoughtful in our and discriminating in our prioritization efforts. What will give us the best benefit? What do we need to work on now? What can we work on later? How do we put our best talent in the right places today for those and stop doing some of the other things? And we have the ability to impact that conversation with data. What is a revenue generation per sales employee for a business unit? What is the benchmark SG&A cost for non-revenue producing role? These are the kind of data points that we ought to be leaning forward to, because otherwise it becomes a cost conversation. And if it's a cost conversation, you're not going to have the impact on the business that you want. You're going to be more administrative on the other side of things. And most importantly, the organization is not going to benefit from what you can bring to the table and the impact that you can have in setting up the organization for the next 10 years. Because make no doubt, if you look back at the other time periods with significant headwinds, those that did the work at this time were the ones that set themselves up as they moved forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. And, it's interesting how, some of these things relate to each other. So you made a point on, locking in your top talent or those that are going to be critical to your mission going forward. That will, that should include, your diverse talent, those in historically underrepresented groups. And, earlier we talked about, approaching layoffs in smaller chunks, right? Well, that is not that's the opposite of locking in your talent, right? Because that will start to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I think that's another reason, going back to, I think you said advocating for one larger layoff early than a series. And I think that's another thing in my experience I have seen is the longer you drag this out, the harder it is to have a cohesive message for your employees that will instill confidence.
Right on. And, to do that, you're going to have very strong opinions as an HR leader. They've got to be around things that matter. Focus on employee advocacy versus defensibility. Thinking about how do you make managers better, and not how do you protect them. How do you make the tough performance discussions and decisions that you need to make, versus allowing historical approaches to win the day. It's a unique opportunity. We have the ability to change it company by company the role that HR leadership plays in the business at times like these. I just hope that we step up to the plate and take advantage of it.
Yeah, I've said this is like the culmination of the last, few years, right? Because I've said it repeatedly. The time for HR to shine is now. We keep, as HR leaders, we've been given one opportunity after another to step up in the leadership for our organizations. And, I think some would have hoped that there would be somewhat of a break between, the last few years and now a recession. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. But, the time is now to shine and to really step up and show, we talked about for decades wanting a strategic seat at the table, yada, yada, yada. And it's exciting. It's exciting, but, it's also a little scary if I'm totally honest. So
100% a whipsaw, right? How do we protect our employees? How do we, how do we change the way we go about business now that everyone has gone? How do I become an expert on MERV 14 filters? How do I keep my talent here now that the talent landscape has moved from local to national? Flip around. How do I know I have the right people? How do I know how do I make sure that we are taking aggressive actions early rather than reactive decisions later? And how do I focus on the right talent especially in the tech space, which is where I spent a fair amount of time over the last decade, where we've been mostly worried about how do I keep coders and product people employed when that market is skyrocketing. And now it's a matter of, okay, which of the 10, which are the 6 that I probably need? It
certainly is a different conversation. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and so one of the things that I've learned in my past, and I've been fortunate to also work with some great larger companies, Ernst and Young, Goldman Sachs, and one of the things that I learned was the companies that lean into change, right, that they get ahead of this, are usually the companies that are best positioned to capitalize when things turn around. And so my next question, is there a bigger picture here? Do you feel that there's more at stake than just surviving a possible recession? Like, obviously that is like, objective number one is survival, but what else should we be looking at here, in your opinion?
Yeah, look, I touched on it earlier. So just to underscore and double underline the point, we have companies who take advantage of these periods of their life cycle, where there are exogenous impacts on the environment that are by definition beyond their control. People who take advantage and take aggressive action and build the organization and build it the right way and drive prioritized decisions and are very thoughtful about the talent decisions that they make and lock in the right people. Those companies for the decade afterwards are set up and they outperform. Those companies that are a bit more haphazard or approach things in a everything is going to be fine kind of environment find themselves doing all of the things we've talked about that diminish trust, which is the organizational wonder drug. If I am pulling headcount out and I'm not doing it in a thoughtful way, I'm doing it on a cost conscious way, and I don't ask the questions in my organizational design discussions around what is the work that needs to be invested in, where will if we invest in this area, where will we be great versus merely good. The companies that don't take that kind of an approach, if they don't make those big bets, they find themselves in a challenging world for the decade to come and get their clocks cleaned in many cases.
And so what other ways, what other opportunities do you think that are out there for setting up your company for success from a talent perspective?
Yeah, be thoughtful about having the right talent in the right place where they can make the biggest difference for your organization. Be thoughtful about today and tomorrow with regard to the up and coming talent, and make sure that you have a good, effective, and unbiased way of assessing who those people are. Two, there is so much redundancy, especially after 15 years of trying to figure out how do I keep up with the growth in an organization. Take this as an opportunity to eliminate redundancy and address business process challenges. If it's just a cost approach, you're going to find yourselves having to do the work, but now you're doing it with fewer people. And you've diminished the organization's faith in leadership that we know what we're doing. And then I think organizational restructures ought to be focused on process redesign and on making big bets, not just pulling headcount out of the system. I worked for Frito-Lay for almost a decade, a great organization. We had pretty healthy number of layoffs during my time there. And yet in all of those, no matter who was running them, we had several CEOs in that time period, several leaders in the HR community during that time period. But we always focused in on how do we better set up the organization for the next 36 months. They continue to do that to this day. So I think those are the three: right talent in the right place. Be really focused in on eliminating redundancy and being very focused in on using the org structure process to make big bets.
Love it. Love it. And so just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, now is the time. We're nearing the end of our conversational section, and we'll be jumping into the Ask Me Anything. We have a few questions lined up, but if you do have questions, please don't hold back. Jackson has a ton of experience. So moving on to my last question before we open up the AMA. So bottom line, what are the one or two key takeaways that our audience should walk away from this conversation with, just regarding, what all people leaders should be doing right now as it relates to the economic uncertainty ahead of us?
Yeah, there's a great John Maxwell quote about leaders adjusting to sails, not complaining about the winds. But it's also true that sailboats go faster heading into the wind. And so this is an opportunity functionally for us to redesign the business and recast our leadership in it. So I think that's the first thing I'd take away from our time. I think the second is if you wait until you're asked to do the work, you have lost the advantage that you have today. You should start building and aligning your plans now, having the conversations about what would we do if we were to be asked for this. That will then lead to here's what we should be doing as a result of those conversations. And because once you have been asked, you have moved yourself from being a strategic advisor back to an administrative expert. And you've lost the advantage that you have as you sit here today. So head into the wind, have good plans, align now, and act before you're asked to.
You heard it right here, guys. There you go. And so I want to jump into the AMA section. We have a few, if you see me over here jotting things down, I'm just transposing the questions that we have. And so the first question, and these are in no particular order, just because I was frantically writing them down. So apologies to the audience. So the first question, too often, this is from an anonymous attendee, too often and too easily it becomes a cost conversation. I'm guessing, the layoffs or adjustments need to be made in the business. How do you avoid a cost-focused approach in your experience?
So I think there are two things that you can do. One is grab the pen. If you're at the front of the room, you own the agenda, and build that agenda with the senior leader, CHRO case with the CEO, on how you're going about the process. If you can build that alignment up front, and you can build if you can build the assumptions that you're going to go under, if you can align on what the agenda is, and if you have the pen to facilitate it, I think that is super helpful. Number two, I think getting clear clarity on if we approach this in a different way, we can solve for both business performance and cost reduction, and have a good and compelling case on how that will work. Possibly even finding an individual in the organization where you can partner with and have kind of a lead test candidate to drive the balance of the conversation. So I think owning and controlling the process, building alignment up front, and having a test case, I think are three things that could be done.
Love it. Love it. And so with that, I'm going to shift to jump around here. The next question that I got, also anonymous, my leadership team hasn't started any RIF discussions. I think we should have already started this process. How can I escalate or position, tee this up for discussion?
Yeah. So I would think about how to leverage the language that everyone uses, and that is finance. So I would partner with your finance leader and build the unholy alliance and possibly the unholy trinity with the CEO if you do it, and start it small. The line leaders, the operations folks are going to be less likely to run headfirst into it, because candidly, they're not the experts on this, and they're the ones that if you're in a sales world, you're going to be overly optimistic of what the revenue future is going to be. If you're an operations person, you probably think you've already leaned and Six Sigma'd your way into the optimal organization. And it's really by having the CFO, the CEO, and the CHRO, by whatever titles, and whatever layers in the organization, by having those three folks on board as to what you're trying to solve for. I think that's where I would start.
I think that is great advice. And so jumping around here, next question, severance packages. What are you seeing as common practice these days?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to a couple of colleagues of mine over the last 2 weeks, and that question got raised. And what we found was that there was wide fluctuation, but generally speaking, there tend to be minimums. And so somewhere between 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, depending on the layer in the organization. They tend to be tied to the amount of time you've been with the organization. And so whether it's 1 week or 2 weeks, I think it really depends on what industry you're in. And then I think at different layers, you have some ceilings, and I've seen those as low as 16 weeks. And as high as a year, depending on where you are in the organization. If you're kind of VP and above, it's not uncommon to be 6 months plus. But if you're a manager level, somewhere in that 16 to 26 week max is where I've seen it. The one thing that is a best practice that I highly recommend is you don't have policies, you have guidelines. And what that allows you to do is solve issues. Sometimes those issues are folks that you're going to take advantage of a process to clean up and invest in your organization, but they may make some noise on the way out the door. You have the ability to leverage it that way. You also have the ability for that 30-year employee who just would keep working until they die, but it's time for them to move into their next stage of life. You have the ability to handle that person in an isolated case and treat them with respect and compassion as well. So guidelines versus policy, I think is probably an important one to consider as well. I found about 1 out of 4 uses some sort of outplacement services. My friends,
interesting. I would have thought that would excuse me. I would have thought that would be higher than that.
Yeah, I think it really depends on where you have been playing and at what level. But certainly the higher you go in organizations and the more public the organization, you tend to have more leverage of it. I recommend it because it does a couple of things. One is it allows you to add some value and allow someone to walk out the door, in most cases not because they want to, but they're walking out the door and you have the ability to give them some help and assistance, and it's not very expensive. Equally important is the folks that survive the layoff. And it allows you to, in an authentic way, talk about your values and how you lived them in a very difficult situation, and tried to help. So I think both of those benefits come from the leveraging of services. And there are some good companies out there. I have primarily leveraged my friends at Challenge, Great, and Christmas. I think they do a great job.
So last question that from the Q&A, from the audience Q&A, and then I have a couple of curveballs I might throw your way if we have time.
Sure.
So what are your thoughts on employee communications during times like this? Haven't made any definitive decisions yet, but we also are getting more concern from our employees. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you asked that question. I had a different client that I was working with that I advocated what I'm going to share with you, which is transparency to the degree that you can, you know, and let them know what you don't know yet. And you know, ideally, you're sharing with them enough about business performance that they understand. The reason why layoffs are likely to be in the future is because the cost of raw materials going up, the cost of labor going up due to the inflationary pressures that we find ourselves in. And if you have the transparency with that data, you know, they can see it coming before you have to kind of talk about it, right? And the question I got was, well, what if all of the news is bad? And what I shared with the person that asked the question is, do you think that if you don't tell them, they won't be thinking about it anyway? So do you want to own the message, or do you want to let them create the boogeyman and resolve it in their own heads, whatever way? Because I would rather own the message and talk through it. So look, I think it's important to be transparent. I think it's important to be authentic, and it's important to be timely. So to the degree that you don't know, it is okay to say, I don't know. If the question is coming up. The worst thing you can do is say, no, we're fine, and then have to take some sort of action. And as a leader, once you've said it's fine, you're going to be more hesitant to take the required action, because now you have an integrity thing that's been played in there. You know, I went through a pretty large acquisition and integration, about a $4.4 billion one back in the early 2000s. And I'm sorry, late 2000. And you know, it was clear that we were going to have fewer headcount on the backside of it, but we didn't know how we were going to do it. We didn't know when we were going to do it. We didn't know anything. And so what we said very clearly was, we're going to communicate more frequently. When we know things, we are going to tell you. And if we haven't told you yet, it is because we haven't decided yet. And you have the ability to ask any question you ever want at any time, and we will get the answer out to everybody. And some of those made for pretty uncomfortable conversations. But at the end of the day, that's how we went through we pulled about over $100 million worth of headcount savings out of the business. And on the backside of it, had the highest org health score among the company in the Americas. So you can do both at the same time. And I think communication, transparency, and authenticity is a big part of it. Just don't go and hide. If you hide, people will reach conclusions, and they're probably worse than the ones you would otherwise share with them.
Well, yeah, and no one likes surprises. You know, I think we most commonly talk about that with like CEOs or executives or like managers, like they just don't like surprises, right? So be forthcoming with information. And I think the same holds true the other way, right? Like if you're really looking to destroy all the progress you've made over the last few years, over the last decade, all the investments that you've made in employer brand, like, wow, in one fell swoop, you can really just completely tear all that down by hiding or miscommunicating, and then, you know, boom, hitting your workforce with a RIF or with a reduction. And so I think that it still happens, and it will happen. There will be, you know, we're going to continue to see news. Like right now, there's a lot of news of the companies that literally ratcheted up recruitment and hiring, literally up to the point to where they then announced, you know, I think Snap is probably one of the top of mind examples that I have. But it's like, how can you ratchet up your recruiting and then boom, seemingly overnight, you know, reduce your headcount by 10%, 20%.
As a leadership team, it makes you look like you're reactive, right? Because you are. Now, as you were talking, I had the thought there's probably someone out there that's listening and saying, okay, you want us to be transparent. Well, that will then signal all of my top talent to leave and go find safer harbors. perhaps, which is why if you go back earlier in the conversation about what we should be doing now, it is lock in those people, know who they are, and lock them in, both financially and connectively, and say, look, we don't know exactly what the world is going to look like over the next 18 months, but we think we're going to have some headwinds. We want to make sure that you're aware. You are a critical player for us. And here's how we're going to demonstrate that. We're going to set up a different mentoring program that we've had before. Once a month, you're going to have, be a part of a small group roundtable with our member of the senior team. Or, hey, here is a cash-based bonus that we're going to give you over the next 18 months as we work our way through. There are lots of ways of going about it. Doing both is really important. If you don't lock in your top talent first, it makes it much more challenging to be able to advocate for transparency in your conversations.
Yeah, I think that's my number one takeaway from this conversation is being proactive, obviously in a general sense as it relates to this topic, recession proofing, getting ready for what could be really, really rocky times ahead. But, also being proactive about locking in your top talent, because I think that last point that you made is, as a business owner and a CEO, often pops into my head, like the double-edged sword of open and honest of full transparent communication is like, what if this is taken the wrong way? And what I'm hearing is there are ways that you can operate within your values of honesty, open communication, whatever that is. Most companies have a value that relates to transparency and open communication, right, and still, lock in your top talent and alleviate some of the concerns that they might have. And so thank you for sharing some of those tactics. Are there, and so, just a quick follow-up to that. So typically in these arrangements, is it commonplace for them to be these, any compensation related payments to be made over a period of time, almost like a retention type of structure?
Yeah, I would build it that way, right? Because think about what you're trying to solve for. You're trying to solve for retention through a period of challenge, and make sure and help them feel like they're valued, part of the go forward business. And so I think structuring it like your retention payment is good. The challenge in the environment that we are going to find ourselves in, I have predictions about kind of what the go forward earnings are going to look like, because I don't think everyone is going to be proactive on this. And so I think you're going to have some stock market challenges, and we've seen them over the last 2 to 3 months. I think we might see them over the next 2 or 3, not financial advice. But that does hinder your ability to leverage equity in the way that you normally would for locking someone in for long-term growth of the organization. So you have to be a little bit more, a little bit more thoughtful about it. How do I tie it to individual objectives? How do I tie things? Ideally, it's both performance and
company
and service time, right? So
got it. Yeah, the other thing I love about what you shared is also, the formation of talent groups, right? So bring them into, and you can position these groups to help solve some of the business challenges that because there's going to be no shortage of challenge, right? And so bringing the future talent of the organization to provide solutions. And man, what great experience, for those. Like I had the great fortune of being included in some of the task forces in the past, and man, those were some of the toughest times as an HR professional I've had, but those are some of the highest periods of growth that I had as well. And so I can't believe it. We're here at the top of the hour. We like to close these, promptly so everyone can get back to their working day. But Jackson, it's been such a blast. Before we close the podcast, how can people find you if they're looking for any more information about you, Obviously, there's your LinkedIn page. Is there any other ways that people should reach out to you?
Yeah, you bet. You can find my website. It's at 90consulting.com. And really easy to track down. It's Jackson at 90 Consulting. I'd love to help you and your organizations as you're going through these periods of transition. I'm here to help.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jackson. I really enjoyed this episode. I appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Stephen. And I think the service again that you're doing for the function is top shelf. I appreciate the work that you guys do.
Of course, of course. Well, that's a wrap for today, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.